What makes our faith in the resurrection credible?
Yeah, it's a question probably best answered by N.T. Wright. The best book I've ever read on the resurrection is by N.T. Wright, the Anglican theologian, who's now the Bishop of Durham. But for many years was a very high-level biblical scholar. He wrote a 800 and some page book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. His argument, if I can put a very complex argument into a nutshell, there'd be no clearer indication for a first century Jew that somebody was not the Messiah than his death at the hands of Israel's enemies. Because the Mashiach of Israel, the anointed one, was the one who was meant to deal with the enemies of Israel. One of his tasks was to deal with Israel's enemies and to reign as the Lord of the nations. Therefore, the clearest sign possible that somebody was not the Messiah was that he was put to death by the Romans. And of course, you can hear that even in the Gospels, can't you? The disciples, they run away when this happens. The disciples on the road to Emmaus, they say, ironically to Jesus himself, well, we thought he was the Messiah. Implication, clearly he's not. I mean, one thing you know for sure is he's not, because the Romans killed him. Therefore, N.T. Wright says this: what's really weird from an historical standpoint, not theological yet, just history, how Christianity emerged as a messianic movement, right? Because that's the claim of Paul and the others, is that when Paul says Jesus Christos, that's all he's saying in Greek is Yeshua Mashiach. Jesus is the Messiah. Well, people say, he was killed by the Romans. You admit it. How could you possibly claim he's the Messiah? The only way, N.T. Wright says, and I think he's right about this, simply from a historical standpoint, to make sense of that claim, is that Jesus rose from the dead. His cause goes on. It's a myth that expresses the fact that his disciples found him very inspiring. I mean, none of that would have been the least bit convincing to anyone in the first century. What Paul does say over and over again is anastasis, resurrection. There's the claim that I think becomes very credible against the backdrop of Jewish messianic expectations.
And how can we draw light maybe on how maybe this is not just the experience of the apostles? Is it just an experience? And can you maybe show how the resurrection is a full bodily resurrection?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that that's how they portrayed it. You know, to take those texts seriously. They're telling us what they experienced. And they emphasize the fact that Jesus is bodily present. He says, well, touch me. See, I have flesh and bones. I'm not a ghost. The fact that in Luke he eats fish with them. That extraordinary speech in the Acts of the Apostles when St. Peter says, he was made visible, not to everybody, but to us, to those, and then he says this, who ate and drank with him after his resurrection from the dead. I always find that breathtaking, that claim. Because no Jew in the first century was expecting that. None of them. The most optimistic were expecting maybe the end of time. All the righteous people would rise in their bodies at the end of time. Most Jews thought the dead went to Sheol, some shadowy underworld. Many Jews thought when you died, that was it. You just go back in the dust. Nobody was expecting that someone who died would then rise from the dead so that he could eat and drink with you after the fact. But that's the resurrection faith. That's the resurrection proclamation. Subjective experience, they're very interested, it seems to me, in saying it wasn't just a subjective experience. And furthermore, if that's all they were claiming, no one would have found it the least bit interesting. So if Paul had gone into Corinth and said, there's this dead rabbi that I found very inspiring, so what? So what? Who would care about that? Everyone's got an inspiring philosopher or hero or guru. So what? That can never begin to explain what I would call the excitement and novelty of the New Testament. Something new broke through here. And they're trying to tell us as bluntly as they can. They're trying to tell us, here's what we experienced, you know? So I think the subjective interpretations are much more modern. They're much more born of our contemporary experience.
Father, another interpretation that's born of our contemporary experience is that possibly Jesus survived the crucifixion. How would you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I've always found it comical. When I was a teenager, there was a book called The Passover Plot that was very popular, and I read it when I was about 14 or 15, and it made that argument, which is a very old argument, that Jesus was drugged on the cross, or he went into a swoon, and then they took him down, and then in the tomb he revived. You know, I mean, give me a break. Let's say it happened. Let's say Jesus was crucified by the Romans. Romans were very serious about crucifixion. They didn't mess around. This man would have been massively wounded, right? Think of the scourging by the Romans, followed by crucifixion. Let's say by some miracle, he just went into a swoon and survived, right? And then he was revived in the tomb. Do you think as this poor soul staggered out of his grave, covered in blood and wounds, people would have said, I'm going to base my new religion on him? They would have said, get that poor man to a hospital, or get that poor man to a doctor. Would this have ever inspired what you see all over the New Testament, which is the explosive new faith in the God of Israel revealed in Jesus Christ? So to me, it's a pathetic attempt to explain the novelty and excitement of the New Testament. It's a very old theory that, you know, when they lifted the sponge with the vinegar off the Jesus, there's some kind of drug on it, which then gave him the semblance of death. But come on. So say he'd come out of his grave. Would that have inspired anyone to start a new religion? No way. No way.
And kind of maybe in light of this kind of full bodily resurrection, how do Christians correctly construe maybe the resurrection of the body?
Yeah, well, we take the body very seriously. I'm working right now on a book on St. Irenaeus, and I'm always impressed by that. Irenaeus is a very early figure. He dies around the year 200, writing in the 170s, 180s. He was taught by Polycarp, who was taught by John. So he's very close to the apostolic period. And one of the dominant themes in Irenaeus, in his multi-volume work, is the body. The body. He takes the body seriously. He was opposed to that Gnosticism, which was very big in his own time. There's versions of it today that privilege the soul over the body, or the spirit over matter. And Irenaeus is having none of it. He's having none of it, because he knew the biblical witness was a very incarnational witness, that God made flesh, he made the world, he became flesh in Jesus, and he rose from the dead in his body. And so Irenaeus takes with utter seriousness the full, corporality of the resurrection. We're always tempted, though, toward a Gnosticism that would divide soul and body, and that would privilege the soul over the body. We say, no, God made us in our entirety, in our unity as body and soul, and he saves us in our entirety, body and soul. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and that means everything in them. Even the creepy, crawly things on the earth, Genesis emphasizing that God made them and called them all good. So that the corporality of our faith, which is reflected for Catholics in the corporality of the sacraments, is a very important thing. And we should avoid the Gnosticizing tendency to privilege spirit over matter.